Good morning and welcome to the new edition of Dr. Lamba's Awakening Call. There have been reports, and not only reports, but plenty of evidence that the Canadian elections were not very free the way they ought to be, that they were manipulated by another country, and that manipulation was done possibly with the connivance, but definitely with the knowledge of the government in power. There is a growing evidence of liberal Chinese collusion. The latest example came to our knowledge just yesterday evening. Senator Yun Pa Wu, the leader of the independent senator group, has been seen to be a stooge of Chinese communist regime. He was told by many public spirited people yesterday to resign and go home. Last week also Wu got a similar reaction when he tweeted about the release of the two Michaels when Hua executive Meng was released. According to Wu, it was a happy day. And he urged the Canadians to ponder the lessons learned. Lessons learned that shows clearly that these two people were arrested by the Chinese only as a counterpoise to Meng's arrest. And then a former U.S. ambassador, Cass Freeman, says that U.S. assisted by Canada took Meng hostage in the first place as a trade and technology war with China. That means when the senator says that, it deserves a rebuke. And by claiming Meng was taken hostage, Senator Wu has violated his oath as a Canadian senator and should resign. But then coming to that, how this senator is a stooge. But I won't care for one senator. I do care about the way a systemic interference was there in the Canadian elections. The elections are over, the results are out, 35 days of campaigning, voting in the midst of fourth wave of pandemic, days of counting mail-in ballots, and spending of $600 million of the taxpayer money. And what's the result? Absolutely identical to the elections of 2019. So, what was the benefit? Justin Trudeau will remain the Prime Minister which he would have continued of a minority government. All parties will return to the Parliament Hill in Ottawa with only minor adjustments. But the real winner in the Canadian election is really not Trudeau and the Liberal Party. The real winner is CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And the evidence that is emerging of the Chinese interference has resulted in voting irregularities. What has been titled as the status quo election was evidently beneficial, and it yields Canadians' most pro-China parliament ever. I've shown you one example of a senator who is as a stooge, and he's a chairperson of the independent group of senators. And not only that, the elections with the connivance of the Chinese has returned to power nation's most authoritarian setup. Deep corruption in the Chinese-Canadian regime is being exposed. The most astounding part is that the Canadian elite have deliberately pursued this dangerous relationship for decades. And the people are not aware. The so-called transparency is lacking. The 44th general election held recently saw the lowest voter turnout since 2008, with only 62.9% participation, and that figure is by the Election Canada. 17 million Canadians voted, including 1 million ballots which are mail-in ballots. And what's the result? Liberal Party won 159 seats, Conservatives lost 2 seats, Bloc Québécois gained 1, NDP gained 1, and Green Party lost 2. But basic parameters have remained the same. The source of Liberal victory was strong performance. Now imagine, only in the populous urban centers, Liberal Party won. Liberals captured 48 out of 53 districts in Greater Toronto and 15 out of 23 districts in Greater Vancouver. So Toronto and Vancouver combined have given the Liberals the right to rule over whole of Canada. Now, although the Conservatives gained vote in Ontario and British Columbia, they did not win districts in the metros because of the unexpectedly high Liberal vote counts. These regions did not follow the statistical pattern for the rest of the province. Up to a dozen seats, and herein comes the crux of the matter. Dozen seats in heavily Chinese Canadian areas have been lost. And why? Because of the Chinese language efforts by the pro-Beijing groups. Now this has not been released earlier. I was looking at a report that the defeated Vancouver area Conservative Kenny Chiu, he was defeated not because the people didn't like him. He lost his seat by 3,000 votes. And if we compare it to the earlier election, he had won it by more than 8,000 votes. This is a defeat well out of proportion with the overall results of the election. Throughout the election time, all the Mandarin language newspapers were following the lead and the misinformation on WeChat. WeChat is a popular Chinese social media site like Twitter. So, why were they angry with you? He had moved a private member's bill last year which required foreign agents to be registered with Ottawa. Now that was a red rag to a bull. Chinese knew that they have got number of agents, not only in the political parties, but in the corporate circle, as I will tell you. So they knew that if all these things are known to the people, it will be a calamity. So they said, this man should not be successful. So WeChat and all the Mandarin newspapers were out against him, gunning for him. Chinese government particularly target candidates running in the predominant Chinese Canadian areas. In the election early days, imagine the ambassador of China to Canada, Kong Pyu. He warned Canadians, mind you, a foreign diplomat warning Canadians not to elect parties that smear China. There's a newspaper, Global Times, which is run by CCP, Chinese Communist Party. They had a editorial and they said that there will be a strong counter-strike if the Conservatives won. Another newspaper, South China Morning Post, noticed, and they brought it out very clearly, they didn't hide it, that there was the phenomena of heavily Chinese Canadian districts turning dramatically against the Tories. Richmond, Canada's most Chinese city. What happened? The Richmond Center Conservative candidate Alice Wong was defeated. Last time she had won by 20 points, and this time she was defeated. Now, this is a disturbing development. Although the media scoffed at the prospect of foreign interference and fraud, and they would because they got $600 million as a payoff from the Liberal government. And I agree there might not have been fraud, yes, but the interference has been there. And then look at the committee, National Security Committee, which is a government body. This National Security Committee in 2020 reports specifically that China is a threat to the Canadian system and it's a prime mover of foreign interference. Now look at the other part. There is a correlation between the provinces with the most mail-in ballots and provinces with the Liberal votes. Where there have been more mail-in ballots, Liberals have won more. Currently, 200,000 mail-in ballots have not been returned. They have not been received. Where have they gone? Possibly they voted for the Conservatives or for the NDP or for the Green Party. So they are simply not available. Blacklock's report revealed on September 24 that many voters who requested a mail-in ballots never received it. And the federal government is unsure where those mail-in ballots are located. Quite possibly they went to those people who used them to vote for the Liberals, but the real voters did not get them. And there was evidence in USA in 2020 that mail-in ballots opened the doors for terrible fraud. And a great deal of the disturbing evidence was found. And did you find, wherever the mail-in ballots are, in USA it was Joe Biden winning. In Canada, the beneficiary is Justin Trudeau and his party. Then, the day Canadian elections ended, the US government made a sudden plea that the chief finance officer of Huawei, Meng, who has been detained for criminal charges, should be released. Simultaneously, China released 2 Canadian nationals who had been detained for more than 1,000 days. Now, even a blind person and a mentally retarded would see the connection. That this was a deal via USA between the Liberals and the Communist Party of China. And China clearly executed hostage diplomacy successfully. Then another thing which is very painful, is shocking to witness the influence of the power of Chinese Communist Party over India. Chinese Communist Party was interested that Trudeau should win. But this relationship is not new. It has been cultivated over the generations. Now this is something which most of the people are not aware. By the way, there is a guy called George Soros, one of the very rich people, who is a leftist agent in USA. Do you know who is a George Soros in Canada? No, you don't. Well, I'll come to that. Coming back to how the Chinese started interfering, the man most responsible for Canada's pivot to China is none other than Pierre Trudeau, father of Justin Trudeau. Trudeau's affection for China and the dictators is long back. He visited China in 1949 as and he was one of the first Western leaders to normalize relationship with Mao Zedong. When visiting China during the period Great Leap Forward, Tiananmen Square type, in which millions of the Chinese people starved to death, Trudeau wrote a book about China. And he said, we are convinced that we are witnessing the beginning of an industrial revolution. So the trend towards pro-China started. And this vision of Trudeau was developed in perhaps the most powerful man in Canada. It might seem to you very strange, but one corporate family empire in Canada has powerfully influenced every prime minister since 1979. And it's just one corporate family. Now, be prepared for the show. The two-headed monster has been created, which deals with the Canada relationship with China. It's a political head and a corporate head. And a Chinese newspaper, Epoch Times, reported in January 2021 that there are ties between Beijing and Canada's elite and the most powerful. And this corporate, which is the most powerful, and people think it's only one part, one business. No, it's not one, it's more than 20 businesses. The tentacles are followed. This is Montreal-based Power Corporation. It's a multi-billion-dollar financial service company. It is the premier gatekeeper of Canada's former relations with China. In 2019, a book was published, Claws of the Panda, which deals with it and analyzes it. Now, the founder, who is the George Soros of Canada, is Paul Desmarais. He arrived in Quebec, a penniless guy, but within a couple of years, he built a powerful group of companies, from bus lines to hydropower to investment banking. Now, a guy who comes penniless, in a few years, he becomes a tycoon, multi-billion tycoon, from where the money comes. Evidently, from the masters who were manipulating him. And based in Montreal as it is, Power Corporation became intertwined with Canada's ruling elite and literally became the kingpin of Canadian politics. 4 former prime ministers, apart from scores of the influential people, have links with the Power Corporation. Former Prime Minister John Chrétien's daughter is married to André Desmarais. He is related to Paul Desmarais. Chrétien, Pierre Trudeau, Brian Mulroney, they have served as advisory board members of Power Corporation after leaving office. They left the prime ministership and got millions of dollars as salary as members of the board of Power Corporation. Former Prime Minister Paul Martin was president of one of the company's subsidiaries, Canadian Steamship Lines, and later bought it. Paul Martin bought it then in the 80s, and nobody knows about it. Imagine it. So this is the way the prime ministers, 4 prime ministers, were suborned. All 4 prime ministers are mentioned, that is, Chrétien, Trudeau, Brian Mulroney, Paul Martin. They were related, had ties with Power Corporation before being elected even to the office. So all joined strong financial support from them. So since they were having support, they had to do what the bosses wanted it. And the bosses wanted them to support the China. But if that was enough, might not have been a problem. As a matter of fact, nearly all prime ministers from 1970 to 2021 had ties with Power Corporation, except one prime minister. The only exception was Stephen Harper, who was the wild card from Western Canada, had no ties to the French political elite. But when he went away, Justin Trudeau restored the premiership to being loyal to the Power Corporation elite. Now this Paul Desmarais, he is, as I said earlier, the George Soros of Canada. And he is the man who is responsible He is also a founder member of the Canada-Chinese Business Council. And the business mogul once remarked that Mao was one of the four historical figures he respected most. It was founded in 1978 and it is the most powerful lobby group in Ottawa. And the council has become a powerful investigator in the Liberal Party brain trust. Many members and former members of CCBC have been ministers, ambassadors, and key advisors to the Canadian government. They include, now look at the CCB, who are there? Chinese-owned company CITIC, Power Corporation, BMO Financial Group, Bombardier, SNC-Lavalin. You remember, SNC-Lavalin was charged with fraud and Trudeau protected it. So much so that the minister Judy had to go. Barrick Gold Corp, Export Development Corp, Canada, Manu Life, Sun Life, all these groups are at one time were based in Montreal. So the Canadian political and corporate elite with the Chinese officials had very strong relationship thanks to this group, Power Corp. So Power Corp was a facade behind which all the manipulations were done. And the office of the Prime Minister, PMO, became one of the chief enablers of Chinese propaganda. As a matter of fact, the elite in America sold it to China and they enabled a communist infiltration. And that is the same as happened here in Canada. Now, what's the outlook for Canada? What should you expect now that Trudeau is the Prime Minister? I have no problem with Trudeau. He's a young man. He has his eccentricities. But what I'm worrying about is he is increasingly becoming authoritarian. I was reading that he has promised to restrict travel inside Canada. He is trying now to impose vaccine mandate. Okay. If it's in the good of the people, no harm in that. But restricting protest and legal challenges to the authoritarianism, and he's using Canadian Revenue Agency to persecute political opponents. The same person who supported farmers' protests in Canada, in India, is now moving to ban protests in Canada. He is banning firearms and the legislature are being instructed for the censorship of the media. You remember the last days of the campaign. He said that they'll have electoral reforms. If those reforms are there, you would find that it will be manipulated. And then another thing, in 2022, Canada is scheduled to redraw the ridings. And what I have always talked about, the gerrymandering process will start. They will reform the ridings so that where they lose by a huge margin. Where they win by a thin margin. So Canada, because of the Chinese interference, should be prepared for a very strong, very authoritarian Trudeau government, which will have very close relationship with the Radical Socialist Party, NDP. There will be a collusion between Trudeau government and the Communist China. It may not be very harmful economically, though it would be, but definitely from the political point of view, it is bleak outlook. And I shudder to think of what would happen to this so-called heaven on earth of freedom, liberty, and progress. Would it become a backwater of authoritarianism and regimentation? Hope not, but let's be prepared for that. Thank you.